I'm about to tell you a story you've probably never heard before, but this story contains one of the bravest moments of World War II, and the tragic part is that almost no one knows about it. June 2nd, 1944, just 4 days before D-Day. The entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the largest military landing in history. But that night, in a small English town, thousands of people had fallen asleep without any idea of what was coming. The residents of Soham didn't know that within a few hours, their town could be wiped off the map. If this is your first time watching this channel, this is where I tell the lesser-known but extraordinary stories of World War II. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because these stories aren't in your school textbooks. I'm the only one telling them here, so I recommend you don't miss out. Learning history from a different angle and a bit more deeply is a wonderful thing, and it's entertaining too. Now, let's go back to that night. If you're ready, you've subscribed and liked, right? All right then, thank you. Let's begin. It's 15 minutes past midnight. A heavy freight train is departing from Whitemoor Marshalling Yard. The locomotive number is WD7337. Behind it are exactly 51 wagons, and what's inside those wagons? 400 tons of bombs. Yes, you heard that right. 400 tons. These bombs were being transported for the United States Army Air Forces as part of D-Day preparations. The destination was air bases on the East Coast via Ipswich. Now, think about this. To understand what 400 tons of bombs means, let me put it this way. In 1943, the Royal Air Force used approximately 400 tons of bombs to level the German city of Lübeck. 62% of the city was destroyed. 1,000 people died. 15,000 were left homeless. That night, exactly that amount of explosives was passing through a sleeping town. 2 men were at the controls of the locomotive. Driver Benjamin Gimbert, 41 years old, a railway worker with 25 years of experience. Beside him was his fireman, James Nightall, only 22 years old, a young man in the prime of his life. These 2 men were about to make a decision that would go down in history. Ben Gimbert was no ordinary man. He was born in Ely, Cambridgeshire, the 6th child in a family of 16 children. His father was a farm laborer. Ben started working on the railways as a cleaner at 15 years old. He worked for years, sweating and toiling, and finally achieved his dream. He became a driver in 1942, but he didn't actually start operating locomotives until 1943. He was married to a woman named Violet, and they had 3 children. James Nightall was born in Littleport and was his family's only child. He left school at 14 and started working on a chicken farm, but that job wasn't for him. He soon moved to the railways, starting as a cleaner at March Station. By the time he was 22 years old, he had been promoted to fireman. When the war broke out, he wanted to enlist, but he was told his job was classified as a reserved occupation. Railways were vital to the war effort. James had met a girl named Edna Belson from Peterborough, and they were planning to get married. These 2 men had no idea their fates would collide that night. The train moved slowly forward, checked at every stop. Carrying bombs is no joke. The explosives are transported separately from the detonators and fuse mechanisms. The wagons are covered with low flammability tarpaulins as a precaution against sparks that might fly from the locomotive. Everything seems to be according to regulations. But something is about to go wrong. What could it be? It's approaching 1:30 in the morning. The train is 90 meters from Soham Station. Ben Gimbert looks back for a routine check, and at that moment, he sees something that makes his blood run cold. Flames. Flames are rising from beneath the first wagon directly behind the locomotive, about 18 inches high, rapidly spreading tongues of orange fire. And do you know what's in that wagon? 44 500-pound general-purpose bombs, a total of approximately 10 tons of explosives in just that one wagon. Now, put yourself in Ben Gimbert's shoes. It's the middle of the night, darkness all around you, and behind you is a burning bomb wagon, and behind that are 50 more wagons loaded with 400 tons of explosives. A sudden break, the slightest jolt could trigger a chain reaction explosion. And that explosion wouldn't just kill you, it could destroy an entire town sleeping just a few hundred meters away. What would you do? A terrifying situation. Would you run? Would you jump off the train and sprint into the darkness? No one would blame you. The survival instinct is the most basic human drive. But Ben Gimbert didn't run. James Nightall didn't run either. Ben began to slow the train down. Slowly, very slowly. Any sudden movement could trigger disaster. It took about 3 minutes for the train to come to a complete stop, 90 meters, just behind the station platforms. When it stopped, the first wagon was completely engulfed in flames. Ben turned to James and gave him the hardest order of his life: uncoupled the burning wagon. Think about it. He was asking him to walk toward a burning wagon that could explode at any moment, loaded with 10 tons of bombs. He was asking him to release the coupling and separate the burning wagon from the rest of the train. If an explosion happened at that moment, there would be nothing left of James's body. Do you know what James Nightall did? He didn't hesitate for a second. He jumped down from the locomotive, grabbed a coal shovel because the coupling was probably too hot to touch with bare hands. He ran toward the flames. He reached the rear coupling of the burning wagon and released it. At that moment, 50 wagons of bombs were separated from the burning wagon. But the job wasn't done. The burning wagon was still next to the station, near the houses. If it exploded there, hundreds of homes would be damaged, perhaps thousands of people would die. They needed to get it out to open ground. James Nightall climbed back onto the locomotive and returned to Ben's side. The two men began to pull the burning wagon. Their plan was to get outside the town, reach an open area, and leave the wagon there. At this very moment, there was another man in the station signal box, Frank Bridges, a 47-year-old signalman. Everyone called him Sailor, that was his nickname. When Frank saw the burning train, what did he do? He didn't run. He grabbed a bucket of water and went down to the platform. Maybe he could put out the flames. Maybe he could do something. As Ben Gimbert started moving the locomotive, he shouted to Frank, "Stop the mail train! Stop any other trains!" Frank nodded and got ready. The locomotive moved. It began pulling the burning wagon, 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters, 140 meters, and then the world exploded. 1:43 in the morning. 44 500-pound bombs detonated in a single instant. More than 5 tons of explosives went up in the same second. The explosion created a crater 20 meters wide and 4.5 meters deep. The locomotive was torn to pieces and its parts were thrown 200 meters away. The station buildings were completely destroyed. More than 700 houses were damaged, windows shattered miles around. The explosion was so powerful that when people woke up, they thought it was an earthquake. James Nightall died instantly. His body was found next to the locomotive, burned and unrecognizable. Frank Bridges was severely injured. The blast threw him to the other end of the platform. He died in hospital the next day. Ben Gimbert miraculously survived. The explosion threw him 200 meters away. His body contained 32 pieces of glass, gravel, and metal. He spent weeks in hospital and underwent multiple surgeries, but he lived. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. Thank you. The train's guard, Herbert Clark, also survived. This 59-year-old man went into shock when the explosion threw him 25 meters, but he got back on his feet. And do you know what he did? In case the mail train was coming, he walked 2 kilometers back down the track and placed warning detonators on the rails. Because if another train came and hit the remaining 50 wagons, 400 tons of bombs could explode. That night, 4 ordinary men did something extraordinary. By putting their own lives at risk, they saved a town. What if they had run? What if they had gotten away from the train and tried to save their own lives? No one could have blamed them. But then, 400 tons of bombs would have exploded. The town of Soham would have been wiped off the map. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people would have died. And 4 days before D-Day, a vital railway line would have been unusable for weeks. Ben Gimbert and James Nightall prevented this disaster at the cost of their own lives. And here's the most striking part. The explosion was so powerful that half the town was damaged, but not a single townsperson died. Only the railway heroes lost their lives. If this story has interested you, please like this video, because stories like this are rarely promoted by the YouTube algorithm. Your likes and comments help these stories reach more people. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into the details of that night. We'll explore the testimony Ben Gimbert gave in his own words, a second-by-second analysis of the explosion, and lesser-known aspects of these heroes' lives. This story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning. If you're ready, let's move on to Part 2. Welcome back to Part 2, dear viewers. In Part 1, I gave you the general outline of that night. Now we're going to go much deeper, because the real power of this story lies in the details. If you've just opened this video, let me briefly summarize. June 2nd, 1944. 4 days before D-Day, a train carrying 400 tons of bombs caught fire in the town of Soham, and 2 railway workers saved the town by sacrificing their own lives. Now we're going to relive that night, minute by minute, almost second by second. If you're ready, let's begin. First, let's set the scene. Soham is a small market town in Cambridgeshire. Population of a few thousand people. Quiet, peaceful, a typical English country town. A railway line runs through its center. This line was critically important during wartime because it was one of the main arteries carrying ammunition to American air bases on the East Coast. At 15 minutes past midnight, the train departing from Whitmore sets off toward Ipswich. Let's look at the full consist of the train. 1 locomotive, 51 wagons, and a brake van. 44 of the wagons are loaded with bombs, 400 tons in total. The remaining 7 wagons contain bomb tail fins and other components. The explosives and fuse mechanisms are transported separately as part of the safety protocol. The locomotive is a WD Austerity 280 type, number 7337, a powerful and durable machine designed for wartime. But that night, this locomotive's durability would be tested to its absolute limits. Now let's get to the story of the burning wagon. This wagon had previously been used to carry sulfur powder. Yes, sulfur, an extremely flammable substance. The wagon had been cleaned, but according to the investigation report, small amounts of sulfur residue still remained inside. And this is where the disaster begins. All wagons were supposed to be covered with tarpaulins. The purpose was to prevent sparks that might fly from the locomotive from reaching the bombs. But the investigation revealed something interesting. 3 wagons, including the burning one, didn't have their tarpaulins properly fitted. Instead of hanging over the edges, the tarpaulin had been folded inward and placed around the bombs. What does this mean? A spark from the locomotive could fall inside the wagon, ignite the sulfur residue that had accumulated under the tarpaulin, and burst into flames beneath the covering. That's probably exactly what happened. No one knows for certain how the fire started. The official report says the sulfur residue may have been ignited by a spark, but there's no definitive proof. Sabotage? It's known that German intelligence made attempts to attack British infrastructure in 1944, but the investigation ruled out sabotage. Counterintelligence was very strong at that time, and almost all German agents had been captured. There's another interesting detail. In 2024, historian Donna Martin examined old fire service records that had been donated to the Soham Museum. In these records, some questions were raised during the initial response, and the possibility of sabotage was briefly considered, but the conclusion was the same: accident. Anyway, let's set aside how the fire started. What matters is what happened after it began. It's approaching 1:30 in the morning. The train is approaching Soham Station. Ben Gimbert is sitting in the locomotive cab. He looks out the left window for a routine check. He notices some steam escaping from the steam injector, so he looks carefully, and that's when he sees it. At the rear left corner of the wagon directly behind the tender, flames about 18 inches high, rising from beneath the wagon, spreading rapidly. Ben freezes for a moment. The calculator in his brain starts working frantically. What's in that wagon? 44 500-pound bombs, approximately 10 tons of explosives. What's behind it? 50 more wagons, 400 tons of bombs. What happens if he brakes suddenly? The wagons crash into each other, a chain reaction explosion begins. What happens if he jumps from the train? Within minutes, the entire train explodes. The town is destroyed. The decision Ben Gimbert made at that moment changed the course of history. He blew the whistle. He signaled to guard Herbert Clark that there was a problem at the rear of the train. Then, very slowly, very carefully, he began to brake. Not a sudden movement, a slow, controlled deceleration. It took about 3 minutes for the train to come to a complete stop. He stopped 90 meters behind the platform plot. When he stopped, the first wagon was completely engulfed in flames. Ben turned to James Nightall beside him. These two men were friends, not just work colleagues, but real friends. Ben had taken James on as his fireman in 1943. They worked together, ate together, knew each other's families. Ben looked at James and said, "Jim, go uncouple that wagon." This seems like a simple sentence, but think about it. Ben was asking his friend to walk toward death. He was asking him to go to a burning wagon that could explode at any moment, and James knew this. He knew what was in the wagon. He knew there were bombs. And what did he do? He didn't think. He didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed a coal shovel, because the metal coupling was probably scorching hot. He jumped down from the locomotive and ran toward the flames. Now imagine that moment. The night is dark. The only source of light is the flames coming from the burning wagon. The heat is unbearable. Smoke is everywhere, and a 22-year-old young man is standing next to 10 tons of bombs trying to release the coupling. What incredible courage! Could you do it? Write in the comments. Let's discuss. James succeeded. He released the coupling. He separated the burning wagon from the rest of the train. But the job still wasn't done. The burning wagon was standing next to the station, near the houses. If it exploded there, the station would be destroyed. The surrounding houses would be damaged. People would die. They needed to get the wagon out to open ground. James ran back to the locomotive and climbed up the side Ben. The two men began pulling the burning wagon. The plan was simple: get outside the town, reach an open area, leave the wagon there. Meanwhile, Frank Bridges was on duty in the station signal box. Frank was a 47-year-old signalman. Everyone called him Sailor. He lived in Soham and had 2 sons, an ordinary man, an ordinary night shift. When Frank saw the burning train, what did he do? He came down from the signal box. He grabbed a bucket of water. He went out onto the platform. Maybe he could put out the flames. Maybe he could help. He didn't run. Knowing full well his own life was in danger, he tried to help. That's the heroism of the British people right there. As Ben Gimbert started moving the locomotive, he saw Frank. He shouted to him, "Stop the mail train! Stop any incoming trains!" Frank nodded. He was going to return to the signal box and take the necessary actions, but at that moment, the locomotive began to move. Meanwhile, at the rear of the train, there was another hero, Herbert Clark, a 59-year-old guard. When the war started, he was already approaching retirement age, but wartime required everyone to work. Herbert ran away from the rear of the train. He headed toward Barway, starting to place warning detonators on the track, because if another train came and hit the stationary wagons, disaster would be inevitable. Now, let's look at the timeline. Around 1:40 a.m., Ben notices the fire. Between 1:41 and 1:43, the train slowly stops. James uncouples the wagon. The locomotive begins to move. 1:43, the explosion. Yes, only 3 minutes. The time from when the fire was noticed to the explosion was less than 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, these men saved the town. The locomotive traveled 140 meters. It was still beside the station platform, hadn't yet made it outside the town, and at that moment, 44 bombs detonated at once. The force of the explosion was incredible. A crater 20 meters wide and about 5 meters deep was created. The locomotive was torn to pieces. The engine block, wheels, boiler fragments were thrown hundreds of meters away. The station buildings were completely destroyed. All that remained was rubble and twisted metal. James Nightall died instantly. At the moment of the explosion, he was probably on the locomotive, beside Ben. His body was found near the locomotive, horrifically burned. Frank Bridges was standing on the opposite platform, bucket of water in hand, ready to put out the flames. The blast lifted him off the ground and threw him. He suffered severe injuries to his head and body. He died in hospital the next day. Ben Gimbert was at the locomotive's controls. The explosion threw him 200 meters away. How he survived, no one can explain. The word miracle doesn't do it justice. His body was full of dozens of shrapnel fragments, glass, metal, gravel. He spent 6 weeks in hospital. 32 foreign objects were removed from his body, but he lived. If this story interests you, please like and subscribe. Herbert Clark was at the rear of the train, about 200 meters away. The explosion threw him 25 meters, dropped him to his knees. He went into shock. His ears were ringing. His balance was gone. But he got back on his feet. And what did he do? He continued with his duty. Staggering, falling, and getting up, he walked 2 kilometers and continued placing warning detonators on the track. The explosion happened at 1:43. Almost the entire town woke up. People thought it was an earthquake. Windows had shattered. Doors had blown off their hinges. Some houses had their roofs collapse. Let me share the testimony of someone who was there that night. George Eden was 16 years old, a high school student who served as a messenger for the local fire brigade. He was sleeping in his bedroom when he was woken by the explosion. When he shook his bed, he saw that all the glass from his window had fallen onto it. When he went downstairs, he noticed the front door lock had blown and the door was wide open. He ran outside and went to the station.
What George saw haunted him for the rest of his life. The locomotive had been thrown to one side, steam escaping from it. Next to it was a burned body. James Nightall's body, unrecognizable. On the other side of the platform, Frank Bridges was lying there. George recognized him because he knew his sons. Frank's head and body were severely damaged. He was dead. Someone asked George to find the mortuary key. A 16-year-old boy, amid two bodies and a destroyed station, went to find the mortuary key. No matter how big the explosion was, let's not forget that the real disaster was prevented. Only one wagon exploded. It contained approximately 10 tons of explosives. 50 wagons remained behind, 400 tons of bombs. If they had exploded too, not just the station, but the entire town would have been destroyed. Let's make a comparison. In 1943, during the major air raid on the German city of Cologne, 1,000 bombers dropped a total of 2,000 tons of bombs. 3,300 houses were destroyed. 45,000 people were left homeless. The train at Soham carried about a fifth of that amount of explosives. But if all those bombs had exploded at once in the middle of the town, the result would have been far more devastating. Because in an air raid, bombs are spread over a wide area. On the train, all the explosives were in one place, right next to each other. Experts estimate that if the entire train had exploded, Soham would have been completely destroyed, hundreds, perhaps thousands dead, and 4 days before D-Day, a critical railway line would have been unusable for weeks. But Ben Gimbert and James Nightall prevented this. There's something else. Despite the explosion being so massive, not a single townsperson died. More than 700 houses were damaged. 15 houses were completely destroyed. 36 houses became uninhabitable. 27 people were injured, 5 seriously. But civilian deaths were 0. This wasn't a miracle. This was the result of 4 men's courage. The explosion was brought under control by 6 in the morning. Firefighters first dealt with a fire that broke out at a nearby gas facility, then extinguished secondary fires. Military units arrived in the area and collected exploded shells and bomb fragments. And something incredible happened. Within 48 hours, yes, only 48 hours, the railway line was repaired and trains started running again. This line was vital for D-Day. Every hour mattered. And British railway workers clearing the rubble and relaying the tracks continued contributing to the war effort. Now let's look at our heroes' families. Ben Gimbert's wife Violet was at home with their children that night. Can you imagine what she felt when she heard about the explosion in the morning? She knows her husband was on that train. She rushes to the hospital, and she finds her husband alive, shattered, injured, but alive. James Nightall's family wasn't so lucky. His father Walter and mother Alice lost their only child. Edna Belson, whom James was planning to marry, lost her fiancé. James was buried in Littleport Cemetery. An interesting detail, his surname is written as Nightall on the headstone, probably a spelling error. Frank Bridges' 2 sons lost their father. Frank was a man who lived in Soham, known by everyone. His death deeply shook the town. In July 1944, about 7 weeks after the explosion, an announcement was made in London. Benjamin Gimbert and James Nightall were awarded the George Cross. The George Cross is the highest gallantry award for civilians, the civilian equivalent of the Victoria Cross. The medal citation contained these words: Gimbert and Nightall were fully aware of the contents of the burning wagon and displayed outstanding courage and resource in isolating it. When they discovered the fire, they could easily have left the train and sought shelter, but realizing that unless the burning wagon was removed, the whole of the 51 wagons of explosives would go up, they risked their lives to minimize the effects of the fire. Ben Gimbert received his medal at Buckingham Palace. James Nightall's medal was given to his family. These men were remembered as heroes. But Ben Gimbert never saw himself as a hero. In interviews he gave later, he always said the same thing: "We were just doing our job." That sentence is perhaps the best definition of true heroism. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and leave a comment. Your comments help stories like this reach more people. And if you're curious, in the third and final part, we'll discuss Ben Gimbert's life after the war, how this event was forgotten, and why we need to tell this story. The story isn't over yet. If you're curious about how this story ends, let's move on to the final part now. But before we do, please subscribe. Thank you. Welcome to the final part, dear viewers. Let's continue. For the past 2 parts, I've been telling you an extraordinary story, a burning bomb train, life-saving decisions made in 3 minutes, 2 dead, 1 miraculous survival, and a town saved from destruction. But now I'm going to tell you perhaps the saddest part of this story, how it was forgotten. Because the truth is, the names Ben Gimbert and James Nightall are almost completely unknown today. They're not in school textbooks, they rarely appear in documentaries, they don't get even a single second in films about D-Day. Yet the success of D-Day was built on the shoulders of these very nameless heroes. Why? Because they weren't soldiers, they weren't pilots, they weren't commandos, they were ordinary workers. A driver, a fireman, a signalman, a guard, railway workers. And history, unfortunately, isn't very good at remembering the heroism of ordinary people. But we will remember. That's exactly why this video exists. First, let's look at Ben Gimbert's life after the war. After Ben was discharged from hospital, he went back to work. Yes, you heard that right. This man who had 32 pieces of shrapnel removed from his body, who was thrown 200 meters, who lost his friend before his very eyes, got back behind the controls of a locomotive as soon as he recovered, because the war was still going on and the trains had to run. In 1953, he received a special medal for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. This medal was an honor given to people who contributed to society. On the day the Queen was crowned, Ben Gimbert walked with 2 medals on his chest, the George Cross and the Coronation Medal. Ben continued to live in March with his wife Violet and their children. He led a quiet life. He rarely spoke about his heroism. He usually turned down interview requests. He didn't see himself as anyone special. Once, a journalist asked him, "What were you thinking that night?" Ben's answer was simple. "I wasn't thinking. There was no time to think. We just did it." That sentence captures the essence of true courage. Courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is doing the right thing despite your fear, and sometimes without even having time to think, instinctively putting others before your own life. Ben Gimbert passed away on May 6, 1976, at 73 years old. He died in March, the land where he was born. I don't know how many people came to his funeral, but I'm sure that those who were there were saying goodbye to a hero. James Nightall died at 22 years old, in the prime of his life. He was going to get married. He was going to have children. He was going to build a career. None of that happened, because that night he gave up his own life so that others could live. James's grave is in Littleport Cemetery, Section E, grave number 292. A simple headstone. His name, date of birth, and death are on it, and the letters GC for George Cross. Nothing else. The entire summary of a 22-year life in just a few lines. But James's legacy isn't just a headstone. In 1981, 37 years after the explosion, British Railways held a special ceremony. At March Station, 2 locomotives were given names. Locomotive number 47577 was named Benjamin Gimbert, G.C. Locomotive number 47579 was named James Nightall, G.C. G.C. is the abbreviation for George Cross. These locomotives worked all across England for years, from Liverpool Street to Cambridge to Norwich. Every journey they carried those names. At every station, every stop, the memory of Ben and James stayed alive. When the locomotives were retired, their nameplates were preserved. Today, Benjamin Gimbert's plate is displayed at the March Museum. James Nightall's George Cross Medal is kept at Soham College to inspire future generations. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's not forget Frank Bridges either, 47 years old, father of two. He was at his post that night. When he saw the burning train, he didn't run. He tried to put out the flames with a bucket of water. It might seem ridiculous, putting out a bomb fire with a bucket of water, but at that moment, that was all he could do, and he did what he could. Frank died in the hospital the day after the explosion. He left behind two sons. Everyone in Soham knew him, a beloved neighbor with the nickname Sailor. The town never forgot him. Herbert Clark, the 59-year-old guard, survived. Even though the explosion threw him 25 meters, he got back on his feet and continued with his duty. In shock, his ears ringing, he walked 2 kilometers and placed warning signals. This man is the least talked about of the Soham heroes. But without him, perhaps another train would have come and hit the remaining wagons, and 400 tons of bombs would have exploded. We know very little about Herbert's later life. This is one of history's injustices. Some heroes are forgotten. Their names fade away. Now, I want to tell you about Soham today. Soham Station was completely rebuilt after the explosion, but in 1965 it was closed to passenger services. It remained closed for more than 50 years. And then, in December 2021, the station reopened, 56 years later. Today, trains pass through Soham again. Passengers get on and off. Most of them probably don't know what happened in 1944, but the town hasn't forgotten. On June 2, 2007, on the 63rd anniversary of the explosion, a permanent memorial was unveiled in Soham. Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, attended the ceremony. The memorial is made of Portland stone, decorated with bronze reliefs. The entire story of the event is written on it. The names of Ben Gimbert, James Nightall, Frank Bridges, and Herbert Clark are engraved. After the memorial unveiling, a remembrance service was held at St. Andrew's Church. The townspeople gathered, prayers were said, and the men who saved the town on that dark night nearly 80 years ago were remembered once more. Every year, on June 2nd, a small memorial ceremony is held in Soham. In 2024, on the 80th anniversary of the explosion, a special ceremony took place. The ceremony began at 10 in the morning, and at 2:45 the church bells rang, a full peal of bells in memory of the heroes. And at that ceremony, a detail that had never been revealed before was shared with the public. In fire service records from 1944, the details of the first response to the explosion came to light. These records had been donated to the Soham Museum, and historians had been studying them for years. Even 80 years later, this story still offers new details. In September 2025, just a few months ago, a special plaque was unveiled for James Nightall at Littleport Station. James was born in Littleport. The town finally honored its own hero. Now, I want to ask you a question. Why am I telling this story? Why am I telling the story of something that happened in a small English town more than 80 years ago on a Turkish YouTube channel? The answer is simple, because this story is universal. Ben Gimbert was English. James Nightall was English. But what they did knows no nationality, it knows no language, it knows no time. When a person risks their own life to save others, it becomes everyone's story. World War II was one of the darkest periods in human history. Millions of people died, cities were destroyed, families were torn apart. But within that darkness, there was also light. The courage of people like Ben and James was that very light. And today, by telling this story, we keep that light alive. There's something else. This story isn't just about the past, it's about today as well. Look around you. Every day, ordinary people do extraordinary things. Firefighters, ambulance drivers, nurses, teachers. Nobody knows their names. They don't make newspaper headlines, but they're heroes too. Ben Gimbert drove a locomotive. James Nightall shoveled coal. Ordinary jobs, but that night, those ordinary jobs saved lives. Maybe a moment like that will come in your life too. Maybe one day you'll have to make a decision. Run or stay. Think of yourself or think of others. You can't know now what you'll do in that moment, but you can know this. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Ben Gimbert and James Nightall proved it. Now, as we come to the end of this series, I want to say something to you. This channel exists to tell the lesser-known stories of World War II, stories that aren't in school textbooks, that don't appear in documentaries, that are on the verge of being forgotten. Soham is just the beginning. In upcoming videos, you'll meet other heroes, you'll hear other stories. Maybe the impossible mission of a British commando unit. Maybe the incredible survival story of an American pilot. Maybe a hero you've never heard of from a front line you never knew existed. But to tell these stories, I need your support. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. And most importantly, tell me in the comments which stories you want to hear. Your curiosity is the fuel of this channel. Finally, I want to end with something Ben Gimbert once said. Years later, someone asked him why he didn't run that night. Ben shrugged and said, "What would have happened if we'd run? The train would have exploded, the town would have been destroyed. We knew we had a job to do there, and we did it. We knew we had a job to do, and we did it." That simple, that powerful. Ben Gimbert, James Nightall, Frank Bridges, and Herbert Clark, 4 ordinary men, 1 extraordinary night, and a story of heroism that deserves to be remembered forever. In their memory. See you in the next video, and remember, history lives on thanks to those who remember it. Subscribe, like, comment. These stories spread because of you. See you soon. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.